Today's topic is words that harm. Words are powerful messages. Words can stir us to action. They can inspire more ethical behavior. They can strengthen relationships. With words shared by another, we can experience comfort, encouragement, or trust. We use words as a key tool when we want to bring out the best in others, in our children, our family, at work, in any encounter. We believe in the power of words. I wouldn't be here speaking and you wouldn't be here listening if we didn't believe in that power. Words are powerful messages. Words can communicate who belongs, and words can communicate who does not belong. Words can comfort, and they also can disturb. Hearing some words, we can experience fear or shame or anxiety. If we believe in the power of words to help, then we must also accept that the power of words can harm. Bullying, for instance, often takes place through words. Bullying, by definition, seeks to harm, intimidate, or coerce someone by repeated behavior in a situation where there is a real or perceived imbalance of power, whether that power is physical or social. Bullying can include actions, but also includes both written and spoken words. They are a kind of action. The harm can become physical in bullying, but often in bullying, the harm is social and emotional. Psychological studies show that bullying can impact children not only through physical harm, but more often mental, social, and emotional harm. Some estimates are that more than a third of children experience either chronic or moderate bullying at school. Bullying can negatively impact the victim's ability to concentrate and thus the ability to learn. And moderate or occasional bullying has the same effect on people as chronic bullying. Bullying can undermine self-confidence, which can then influence achievement. Bullying can also undermine basic trust. And it gets worse. Bullying can magnify depression. Studies have shown that bullying victims are up to 9 times more likely to consider suicide. Bullying victims are more likely to have health problems and eating disorders. And observers of bullying also are impacted. Bystanders may also be afraid and react out of fight, flight, and freeze reactions. When bystanders don't act, they often feel guilty, even shameful for not acting. Their learning and mental health can be affected. One reaction to manage the fear and discomfort might be to join into the bullying. In schools and other environments where children and teens are experiencing bullying, those in authority have a responsibility to act. Unfortunately, those who engage in bullying are often skillful in either creating fear among the authority figures or at ingratiating themselves with the authority figures, or they engage in denial. The infamous, "it was only a joke." We know that bullying is unethical, or at least I hope we can all agree on that. It is also an exception to an absolute right to free speech. The Supreme Court has found in a number of cases that the First Amendment about free speech does not cover certain kinds of words that are significantly harmful to the social order. Fighting words, for instance, which are defined as speech that would, quote, produce a clear and present danger of a serious intolerable evil that rises above mere inconvenience or annoyance, unquote. The First Amendment applies to legal restrictions by a government entity on one's speech. There are many instances where we accept limits on speech that are not by public entities. Parents, of course, do this all the time as part of helping a child learn appropriate communication skills. As a private organization, our ethical society has limits to what speech we tolerate. You have to be invited to give a platform address. Our custom isn't that whoever can get to the front of the room first, virtually or in person, gets to talk at any moment about anything they want. If someone came in who decided to spout obscenities or shout racist or homophobic slurs, whether in person or on Zoom, we would have a right, even a responsibility, to shut that down. Zoom bombing, while rare now, was a significant threat to meetings during the early months of the pandemic, less so later, but maybe mostly because we learned better ways to shut down such speech. That distinction of having to be invited to give a platform address. A few years ago, one of the ethical societies decided to uninvite someone that their program committee had invited to speak. The person showed up anyway, defending their right to free speech and insisting that they give the platform. They showed up with cameras and with willingness to physically resist being expelled. They published the video footage to create outrage. Whether or not an ethical society has a right or responsibility to make choices about who will speak and who will not from the platform is not about the First Amendment right to freedom of speech, since the ethical society is not a government entity. There is room for debate about how much it is desirable to have speakers at an ethical society with whom members profoundly disagree. But simply the fact that we call it a platform implies that what people say in such a formal event on Sunday mornings is part of what we stand for. And thus, I think there's a responsibility to make responsible choices about who represents us through words, not just deeds. As to legal and government boundaries on speech, we've accepted that libel and slander are harmful, and thus are exceptions to absolute free speech. And there's fighting words, or threats of violence, or false advertising claims, unsubstantiated health claims by producers of products, even other kinds of false advertising, are not covered as parts of free speech. It's even legal for the government to restrict otherwise unrestricted political speech to a specific place, establishing so-called free speech zones for protesters, for instance. That last one I find highly problematic, especially when those who support restricting legitimate political protest to certain zones then a few years later described the sacking of the United States Capitol building and the killing of guards as legitimate political protest. So, returning for a bit to certain kinds of insults and their harmful effects. More than 150 years after the abolition of enslavement, with the significant exception that was left in the 13th Amendment, we still have a color line in our culture, to borrow an old phrase. Racial insults are a highly effective way to maintain the color line, to mark those of a certain color as inferior, as less competent, as more dangerous, less worthy, lower status, less deserving of the rights of citizenship like voting, even maybe less human. We could say similar things about ethnic slurs, anti-Semitic insults, misogynistic put-downs, mocking of disabilities, homophobic and transphobic invectives. I'm going to stick this morning mostly with the racial expressions for the sake of focus, but I think the others have similar dynamics, including that such insults have often been defended as free speech, even by those who see other fighting words as legitimately being limited. Gradually, we have accepted limits on speech, privately and legally, around sexual harassment. But we have not really developed the same kind of treatment of racial harassment, even though it can create the same kind of harm that sexual harassment does. I would maintain that racial insults are a kind of verbal abuse. To quote the psychologist Kenneth Clark, human beings whose daily experience tells them that almost nowhere in society are they respected and granted the ordinary dignity and courtesy accorded to others will, as a matter of course, begin to doubt their own worth. And so such abuse affects one's relationships and one's life. It can affect parenting and education practices. It can affect self perception and thus increase stress, with the accompanying physical symptoms of stress. Self perception can also mean not taking risks, giving up on achieving, and so it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. I am not fond of the saying, whatever does not kill you makes you stronger. As others have said before me, a more accurate statement is, whatever does not kill you gives you unhealthy coping strategies. Belittling someone, using words to enforce a hierarchy of who really counts in the world, belittling someone means that the target likely develops unhealthy strategies of withdrawal or hostility. Racial abuse and stigmatization harm both the abuser and the society as a whole, too. The abuser, when encouraged by social norms to abuse another, becomes less empathetic, narrows their field of vision about who is human, and may even begin to experience a kind of paranoia. Society? We do not practice the egalitarian ideals of the society with such sweeping exceptions to who is actually considered to be created equal with corresponding human rights. We teach, if we allow such bullying, that respect for individuals is not really important. And thus, it becomes easier to disrespect the basic human welfare of anyone. Racism can distract from creating an economically just society. Racism reinforces that an unjust system is acceptable. Racial insults are deliberate and conscious participation in portraying some people as less than equal. They are meant to create a hostile environment, whether excused as jokes or said out of anger. In our legal system, battery is defined as a criminal act not only because it is a threat to physical safety, but because it is a threat to human dignity, because it is humiliating. And there are some court cases where racist words were held to meet the standard of extreme and outrageous intentional infliction of mental harm. There have been times when they were treated in the court system as the bullying behavior that they are. But the problem remains, both with legal consequences and what we consider socially out of bounds, that many racial insults and insults for disability or misogyny or homophobia or transphobia, they are not considered extreme. They are so commonplace. Yet these so-called microaggressions also cause harm and exclude people. Microaggressions each may not rise to the level of abuse that a pointed insult could, but they add up to communicate exclusion, to communicate a narrow circle, to reinforce a hierarchy of value, and so they do have an accumulative effect. much like small stresses over time can build up to a heart attack. Our theme for this month's platforms is widening the circle, and that includes to widen the circle of who matters in our culture and our nation. Racist words, misogynistic and ableist words, homophobic and transphobic words, anti Semitic words, all narrow the circle. There are good reasons to continue our nation's commitment to free speech, that is, to the freedom from government restriction of unpopular opinions, unflattering opinions, and political disagreement. What I'd like us to consider today is the selective way we've developed exceptions. We have exceptions, but people often rush to defend free speech when it means racial insults or anti Semitism or other speech whose impact is to reinforce a hierarchy of who belongs, who matters, who is deserving of equal treatment. As happens too often for my taste, events of the past few weeks have highlighted some of the issues in this talk, although I planned it out a few months ago. But maybe that's because this is an issue that is always with us. First, we have seen very recently attacks by government entities on academic free speech. A public community college in Texas has fired several professors in the last months for calling for the removal of memorials glorifying Confederate figures, or for disagreeing publicly with the college's demand that the staff not mention or encourage mask usage by students during a pandemic. State legislators in a number of states have been banning the teaching of so-called critical race theory, which technically is not taught in the public schools anyway. And they add into that, by their definitions, anything which implies that racial inequalities have systemic causes, or that makes students feel discomfort. Of course, they never mean it's about whether Black students, LGBTQ plus students, women students feel discomfort over how they are represented in the current curriculum. It has become a trend to attack any attempt to challenge the long orthodoxy of American exceptionalism with allegations that the challenges themselves attack freedom of speech. Like, I can't say the N-word, you're oppressing me. Or you're making our children read books by people of color and women, and you're oppressing our children by doing that. Second, as I have already referred to, the same folks who falsely portrayed Black Lives Matter protests as uniformly dangerous and overall violent now defend the sacking of the US Capitol and the stalking there, fortunately unsuccessful, of certain politicians to be physically restrained or even hurt or killed as legitimate political protest. Political protest protected by freedom of speech and assembly, I would say, does not include stealing laptops, bringing zip ties and planting pipe bombs, and tasing or stabbing guards. I think the people who make these claims really do know that. Their defense of 1-6 and their critique of other protests makes clear, I think, that it's not really freedom of speech and assembly that they're concerned about. And a third example, a podcast is popular because its words are powerful. The words inspire a certain reaction in those who listen and are meant to. When a service pays millions of dollars to get a podcaster to transmit their words through that service, they are making a choice about who to give a platform to. They did not offer it to everyone who has a podcast. There is no legal requirement to protect the free access of anyone to their service. They are not a government entity. and everyone else using the service, whether to publish their own words or music, or to listen or even to pay to listen without advertising, all of those people are free to disassociate with words that they find harmful. Free speech does not include a right to demand a private entity or even the government give you the platform of choice for your words or to pay you for doing it. Whether it's health information or political opinions, hiding behind the entertainment banner, or just sharing a variety of opinions, or it's just a joke, is an old way of saying, I know these words are harmful if taken seriously, but wink, wink, I'll pretend it's not serious so you can pretend it's not harmful. If you make a good living or millions from your words, you know they're important. Even using the excuse means you know that the words, if said or taken seriously, are harmful and unethical. You don't excuse yourself from words if you really are innocent of their harm. I would go even further and say that the more who listen to your words, the more you are benefiting from being in the public eye, the more important it is that you are responsible for the words you share. The ethics of speech for those with more influence should be even more careful than for private conversation. And no, I do not believe that the podcast that's been in the news, which used the N word for years, used it innocently. The selective use of that on the podcast, the way that the use of the word was laughed about, made clear that it was used in knowledge that it's an insult, that it was used in conjunction with absolutist statements like there's a white brain and a black brain and they're different, adds evidence to the idea that those conversations were rooted in assumptions of racial superiority and inferiority. They were a kind of bullying. To pretend otherwise now is just as disingenuous as the use of the word in the first place. We have always recognized that some harmful words are not part of what we want to protect with freedom of expression, keeping the government out of decisions of what words can have legal consequences. The ethics of speech, I believe, are use your words responsibly. Words have an impact. The greater the impact they may have, the more responsible you are for them. And thus, there are legal restrictions on powerful government limiting dissent, because it is the powerful, in that case, who are exerting power over the weaker. The ethics and legality of harmful words are somewhat different, though, than free expression of other kinds of opinions. But the two things are related. Not everything that is unethical needs to be made illegal, and yet we have a long tradition of holding people responsible legally for harm they do with words, beyond just social approval or disapproval of the words. But we have not in our nation taken seriously some of the harms that words do. We have taken seriously libel and slander of individuals, even of businesses. We have begun to take seriously the creating of a hostile work environment, and sometimes even a hostile academic environment. That laws can be passed, though, based on the discomfort of white students tells me that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of why there are some restrictions on hate speech. One official complaint based on some of the new laws advocated for not teaching that in the 1950s and 60s school desegregation happened, because that might make students, that is, white students, uncomfortable with the reality that schools had to be desegregated, and that some of their families might be shown in videos shouting hateful things in those historical documentaries. Or they might learn that counties closed their public school systems rather than include black and white students in the same school. Or that many white families took their children out of newly integrated schools, forming religious schools that just happened to only include white students. That assessment is not about pointing at people because they're white. It's about pointing at actions that were carried out and that had harmful consequences for others. It's not about saying these people were wrong because they were white. It's about documenting about what some people did and others supported, and then raising those actions up so that we can all decide if that's what we want the future to look like too. It is hate speech to belittle and dehumanize, even threaten harm to people because of the group they belong to. That is bullying based on group identity. It is not hate speech to document history that happened. Those decisions were made and made for particular reasons that we can see in documentation. Just as we can see that the secession before the Civil War of Southern states was always in the official document, credited to the desire to preserve the ability to enslave people. Those are simply historical facts. It is also not hate speech to question and analyze why there is still racial disparity well more than a century after the end of legal enslavement. That is not the same as the harm done by continuing to characterize, for instance, Native Americans as savages, or black brains as different from white brains, or repeatedly belittling people to keep them in their place lower in the hierarchy. There is no evidence that race is a biological distinction beyond the unity of the human race or species. Race was invented by lumping together people of many ethnicities based on a few shared characteristics, and ideas of whiteness were social and legal strategies. It is not an attack on white people to face that reality, nor is it belittling white people to report that white people have constructed laws well into the 1960s, as well as statutes explicitly supporting white supremacy, even in the case of some of the memorials, putting those two words, white supremacy, on the base of the statue. Freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and consequences for words that harm others are not incompatible. We can have those freedoms and still protect from harm. To take an extreme example, there is a group in the US that I know of that claims to be a religious movement. It believes that people of sub-Saharan African origin are mud people, not really human beings like those of European descent are. They also believe that the people of European origin are the real 12 tribes of Israel in the Bible. So Jews are also not really human and are part of mud people. Well, I accept that in a diverse society, it means that people with these beliefs have the freedom from government interference to talk about these beliefs to each other, to publish their own newsletter without that being suppressed by the government at any level. But I do not accept that they have a consequence-free freedom, where they can demand that private or public entities give them access to just any space to speak their beliefs, or to demand that others pay them to express those beliefs, or that they can publicly abuse Jews and people of African origin by what amounts to bullying speech without consequences, whether that's social or maybe even legally sometimes. Someone isn't a bully if she or he keeps their ideas of their own superiority internal and does not act on them or abuse with words. Just as someone can be held legally liable for libel and slander, or false advertising of a product, or fighting words, I believe that we have to consider speech used to enforce a racial hierarchy and attack individuals just for belonging to a certain group as potential fighting words with consequences. Legally, when it is egregious, but social consequences and ethical consequences in any case. You can believe in racial hierarchies, that is freedom of belief. If you express that belief in ways that cause harm, then some level of consequences are also ethical. If we believe words can heal and help, then we have to believe that words can harm. The line we draw for harmful words and consequences tells a lot about what we accept and do not accept as real harm, and also about whose well being we really respect. So we're going to say goodbye now to those who are joining us via video only.